Hey there, welcome to the 7th episode of Open Floor. I'm Ali Mosallay.
And I'm Aryan Narayan.
And we're your hosts for Open Floor.
Before we begin, please follow us on wherever you get your podcasts, like Spotify, Overcast, and Apple Podcasts. A full list is at openfloor.me/listen.
Also, please check out our website at openfloor.me/home and follow us on Instagram at Open Floor Podcast. Now, on to the episode. This year has been and will continue to be a very hectic year. We have the COVID-19 pandemic, overall societal unrest, and even the upcoming 2020 elections.
In the midst of all these happenings, however, the issue of climate change has taken a back seat, despite its continually growing in importance.
That's why we found it crucial to dust it off and bring it to the light of day. We're so happy to partner with the Sunrise movement in Lexington on a 2-part special to talk about and emphasize the importance of the climate crisis. In this episode, we'll be covering the causes and effects of the climate crisis.
We have with us Anya Rao and Kavish Pathak, who are members of the leadership team for Sunrise Lexington. Thank you guys for coming.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you all for having us.
Okay, now before we begin, why don't you explain what Sunrise is and what its mission is to our listeners?
Definitely. So Sunrise is a movement to save our climate, while at the same time creating millions and millions of just, good-paying jobs, and really fighting to tackle the inequities of our country by pushing climate policy and pushing strong climate candidates.
And also, with that, uplifting BIPOC and LGBTQ and those who are silenced in the crisis.
Definitely. All right. Now, at the crux of the climate crisis is the emission of greenhouse gases, right? So that includes carbon dioxide, methane, and ozone. And so could you explain maybe how greenhouse gases are responsible for an increase in global temperatures?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. I think to really understand and talk about the greenhouse gases, you need to kind of really understand what it is. The greenhouse effect is basically when the atmosphere traps heat radiating from the Earth to space. And really, it's been tied to human activity, and human activity is changing the natural greenhouse. And the burning of fossil fuels like coal and oil has really increased the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere. And CO2 and water vapor and nitrous oxide are these gases in the atmosphere that block heat from escaping. And so that's just one of the reasons why.
Yeah, I totally agree with that.
Now, you brought up how humans have been tied the change in the greenhouse effect on Earth, and despite that, many who deny the dangers of climate change argue that these increases in global temperatures that we have observed in the recent decades are actually part of a natural pattern of fluctuation and aren't caused by humans. How do we know that humans are actually responsible for this and that it's a pressing issue that we really need to worry about?
Listen, so we have seen the concentration of greenhouse gases rise since the Industrial Revolution. And, a lot of these climate deniers like Exxon, they've known about this crisis and they've known about global warming for a very long time now. They've spent millions of dollars on attacking it, on this idea, and they actually started drilling faster and faster. And, same with executives across the board on the Industrial Revolution. It's been clearly tied to, the concentration has started. It started to concentrate more in our atmosphere since the Industrial Revolution. And if those big companies are still trying to hide it and lie, then I think that definitely shows a lot of evidence towards it.
Mm-hmm, yeah, and also the fact of burning fossil fuels, right, with ExxonMobil, like Kavish said, the fact that there's 441 parts per million of CO2 in our atmosphere is frankly very insane and just it's mind-boggling to me. And it's very, very dangerous for us to have that much CO2 in the atmosphere, and that is just trapping much more heat into our Earth and increasing the ice caps melting and stuff like that. So
yeah, Exxon knew this whole time. They've known since the 1970s.
Quickly going back to your reference of the 441 parts per million of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, right? So how has that increased over, let's say, years and years ago? Let's say, what were we at maybe 100, 200 years ago, and where are we at now?
Yeah, I mean, this all ties back to fossil fuels and us burning like coal and oil and just really greedy executives like ignoring all this science really at the end of the day, and so that has really increased the parts of per million of CO2 in the atmosphere.
Hmm. Now, there are many different sources of greenhouse gases, so that includes transportation, production of electricity, and even factories. Again, this is just a few of them, but there are so many more sources. And so, which of these major contributors do you believe is the most important and why?
I feel like this all ties back to the burning of fossil fuels, like you mentioned. Transportation, production of electricity in factories, like that all I feel ties back to the burning of fossil fuels because for electricity and transportation, we need to burn coal, or we have depended on the burning of coal and oil to really fuel us. So I think it really does relate back to burning of coal and oil.
I think with this question, it's a question really about our infrastructure in our country. So listen, our country has, you know, relied on, you know, coal, oil, and that's what's caused things. We have been forced to use it for transportation, electricity, factories. Our infrastructure is crumbling by the day. In my opinion, I don't think you can prioritize one over another because for us to solve our infrastructure crisis, we have to solve it with making sure that everything is included. That's why, in my opinion, I don't feel like prioritizing something over another is very productive because then we may forget about a whole aspect of the infrastructure.
Yeah, you bring up how prioritization has become an issue, and that we really shouldn't have to prioritize anything, and they're all equally pressing issues. But one of the well-known contributors, like aside from these well-known contributors to greenhouse emissions, one major source of greenhouse emissions into the air is agriculture, and it accounts for about 10% of our total emissions. And in what ways does this industry contribute to the release of greenhouse gases, and why do you think it has gone unspoken for?
It's because we need agriculture. It's the food we eat. Agriculture is like all sorts of things go into agriculture, from storing manure to, yeah, if you're eating, don't listen to this part, right? But like storing manure, that's a big part of it, organic soils and more. We can't simply get rid of agriculture though. We can't because, we're already having a food crisis, not just in our country about getting people, the food they need globally, right? So it's not like we can abolish agriculture because people need to eat. You can't live without it.
Yeah, like Kavish brought up like an important point of like manure, but then also the fact that like with agriculture, there's like many aspects I feel to it with like land usage, changing land, energy usage, and also with that, like cows and cattle and beef production is it requires like 20 times more land and emits 20 times more greenhouse gases. And I think that it is unspoken of mostly because people haven't gone too long without meat, and I think that companies are coming out with different ways of reducing meat by having plants and like making it so you're eating a burger that tastes like beef but it's not really beef, it's just like plant based. So I think that we are starting to edge onto it, but yeah.
Now let's move more on to the effects of climate change. We talked about the causes for the first four questions, but now let's get to the part which is going to directly affect us in the future. So, the effects of climate change have and will continue to ravage ecosystems around the world, to the point that some scientists and authors have dubbed the time that we are living in as part of the sixth extinction after the first five mass extinction events in geologic history. Could you explain a little about how the climate crisis is affecting ecological communities globally?
When I think about this question, I thought about the movie Rio, in which the blue macaw, he goes to visit like his home in, I believe in Brazil, and he sees like the deforestation and really just like the effects of their losing their home. And I mean, obviously that's a cartoon, but we see this very much in real life. The climate crisis will affect the land, and as rising temperatures, it will make our land much more barren and more susceptible to fires and deforestation too. And We see this with the Australian bushfire crisis and, deforestation, ocean acidification, coral reefs dying, and all of these things because of the climate crisis.
And so, kind of because of this climate crisis, how have the effects kind of have they worsened over time, or have they kind of stayed the same? However, we're just seeing all the effects piling up at this point.
I think they've worsened, I would say, mostly because we've become much more greedy in our fossil fuel like burning with like coal and oil.
Right.
Adding on to that, the effects of ecological communities, climate change is going to affect animals and plants, and this will, no doubt at the end of the day also hurt us, changing our food chain, changing our system like that. And, this would actually hurt a lot. This would actually hit us hard too. That's one thing that, a lot of times goes under talked about when it comes to climate change, about what it's going to do to us with our plants, with our animals.
Yeah. Okay. And so there is also the issue of the climate crisis affecting humanity itself, right? And so there are perhaps an uncountable number of potential future consequences that rising global temperatures could bring upon society. And so this may include rising sea levels, agricultural devastation, and also conditions that are simply uninhabitable. Right. And so, which of these many effects of climate change upon humans do you believe is the most significant to consider?
I can take this question. 250,000 people die every year due to climate change. So there's no question whether it's going to hit hard, and it's going to hit hard in a tons of ways.
Mm-hmm.
People are going to be forced to immigrate because the climate crisis is going to ravage their homes. It can cause severe droughts. We're already seeing it now with, some of the biggest storms and tropical storms out there. We're seeing rising sea levels flood cities like Miami and Houston. My grandparents live in Houston, and when Harvey hit, that was a scary time for them. So we're already seeing the big effects of climate change, and, we're going to continue seeing it and seeing how it hits humans harder and harder and harder and harder if we don't take action now. So, I don't think there's a way to prioritize all the other issues like immigration and forced immigration because of climate change. I don't think we can prioritize that, because at the end of the day, many, 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 many people will be hurt. They'll just be hurt in different ways. And I don't think we can, list off like who's hurting more, because I think that's something that has caused a lot of pain already in people.
Yeah, and when I like read this question, I kind of thought about the fact that like the effects of climate change, especially with natural disasters, there are such different magnitudes, and certain natural disasters will affect certain places, and certain natural disasters won't affect certain places. And I think that in relation to where we live here in Massachusetts, I think like the biggest ones that we will obviously see is like flooding. Any coastal city and town will see flooding. The possibility of hurricanes with Hurricane Sandy really devastating New York, and also been seeing the threat of short winters, especially with the fact that it is becoming much more hotter and shorter with the amount of snow that we're seeing.
There was a time in winter of this year, I think it was in January, correct me if I'm wrong, here in Lexington, it was, what was it, 80 degrees, 85?
Yeah, I remember that.
90,
Yeah, that
I
was a
forget.
memorable day.
Yeah. So actually, I authored a climate emergency declaration for our town, and we were at the select board meeting for it, and one of the select board members said, quote, "How hot was it out yesterday?" I was like, 90 degrees, and she was like, "That's a problem." So we're seeing the effects right now up here in Massachusetts.
Right.
I just quickly want to circle back on something that Kavish, you had said with regards to prioritization, and you had brought it up a couple times. And so my one question is, I guess, if we were to, let's say, abandon prioritization so that we make sure that we get every single issue that's like that we're able to see, is there any detriments to that than to prioritizing maybe the most important issues and then maybe working down towards maybe issues that are things that can be put on hold, so to say?
So there's bigger issues and there is smaller issues. But, in my opinion, we can't prioritize, everyone is going to feel pain. People are already feeling pain. We can't tell a certain group of people your pain is more important than the other people's pain. I don't believe we can put anything at hold right now to serve people. I believe the government's job is actually to serve people and to support people. you know, I don't believe we should, tell a certain group of people that are getting hit harder by this scenario from the climate crisis that they're not as important at the moment, or they're not as important as a whole as this other group of people. Because at the end of the day, you're still getting hurt. We can't prioritize pain.
Most definitely.
Yeah, that's a good point. And also circling back to another point that you'd made, the strength of storms and the frequency of storms is definitely increasing as a result of climate change, and other seemingly unrelated things like the spread of disease, for example, both in water and through vectors like rodents, has also increased. And how are things like this, which we might see as unrelated completely to climate change, be affected by these changes in global climate? And how do you think these changes will affect people, human civilization around the globe?
Hmm. So I think that obviously with the increase in temperature, we'll see melting ice, melting ice caps in permafrost soils. And as these ices and soils are melting, it'll start to release ancient trapped viruses that were in the ice. And as I was reading up on this, I remember seeing this story of this like 12-year-old like kid in the Siberian tundra, and he actually got anthrax. And anthrax is like a very uncommon disease, and he got it through exposure of like a reindeer carcass that had been like iced, and it had been like poisoned with anthrax, and so he came in contact with it, and I believe he actually passed away because of it. So that is really what's going to start to happen if we really don't do something.
Yeah, we're lucky that didn't go into an outbreak. It was so isolated. But, we'll see more diseases and stuff pop up. And we might not get so lucky next time that happens. That whole village and that whole town was hit hard by that. Multiple people died from anthrax in that area. Um, and we are lucky that it didn't get out. But, it may get out one day. There may be a disease that's ancient in the ice that might come out and it might spread. And that's a legit concern that people need to have.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so definitely one topic that's like a subtopic of climate change is intersectionality, right? And so the intersectionality of climate change is often ignored because many people may not know about it, and so we find it important to highlight these seldom mentioned topics. And so, how exactly does intersectionality play into the effects of the climate crisis?
There's tons of intersections, first of all, with climate crisis and other things. It hits harder towards indigenous communities, towards BIPOC communities, traditionally redline communities. You look at the housing crisis right now. Well, also people that are, have been traditionally redlined, specifically BIPOC communities and Black communities that have been specifically, redlined for so long. They're more likely to get things like asthma because they're closer to fossil fuel plants. Um, and so we see it as a public health area. Um, but also, like, let's talk about climate change and, workers. One thing that I think is really underrated, under talked about in the climate movement is people that work in the fossil fuel industry. We move no net zero, no carbon, and no oil means no oil. So think about those people. One thing that we have to understand when we're solving this, an intersection that's going to happen, is what are we going to do to support those outgoing workers? So, making sure those workers get education, give them health care, give them a chance so, they can take care of themselves. Because when you lose your job, you lose your health care.
Mm-hmm.
So we want to also remember that not only that this hits harder towards Black communities, BIPOC communities, indigenous communities, but also the workers that have been powering our country for so long, they're also going to be hit hard when, when we leave, coal, and when we leave oil, and when we got the fossil fuel industry, we got to remember those workers.
Yeah, Kavish like touched upon like a very important point of like, intersectionality, like affecting, or like intersectionality is really finding common ground, no matter who you are, your race, sexual orientation wise, etc. And our common ground in this case is, really the climate crisis. And, like the climate crisis has been affecting the BIPOC community and indigenous communities very, very much. And I think that you can also kind of like, I guess, relate this to the comment or like what's happening right now with COVID, right? Like the lack of government response and the lack of, help going towards like brown and black communities and indigenous communities right now really shows and brings out, inequalities and injustices. And really, at the end of the day, climate justice is racial justice. And we always need to remember that.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And again, there's a million intersections. The climate crisis and gun violence. There's just a ton. And even though we can't go on every one, you have to realize that every single issue is connected in some way through some sort of symptom of pain that this country's leadership has caused.
Yeah, the climate crisis, really a major threat. However, the urgency of the climate crisis is a topic that is under contention, even among people who believe that it is a serious problem. How much time do you guys think that we have before the problem has progressed too far for a solution to be found?
I will say I really hate thinking about this because it makes me really anxious. And like with this, like climate anxiety, I feel like isn't talked about enough. But I mean, if you were like told you only have like X days until you were like until like your life gets worse before like you pass away, like you would be like on edge too, I feel. And I think that scientists have said with especially with the Paris Climate Agreement that but we have to get net zero by 2050, and then we have to actually start doing things up until like 2030. And so I think that that kind of range is what I feel. If we haven't done anything by then, we're, I would say, messed up.
We have 10 years. It's pretty simple. We have 10 years to take action. We have 10 years to get ourselves to as low carbon as possible. 10 years to reroute and change literally everything, our economy and more. It's a lot of work. It's a road that we have to be willing to fight. We have to have the courage to move forward. So yes, it is scary to know that we only have so much time to do so much, but we have to remember we have to put courage and our, not just like, we have to put our planet, the people around us, our friends, neighbors, family, we have to put them, and we have to make sure that we create a movement, a revolution that pushes forward, that creates a better world. So yes, I'm nervous. Are we going to get it done? I don't know, but I know if we keep on fighting, if we keep on getting our friends, family, neighbors, everyone involved, we can create a green revolution. We just have to keep on moving forward, and we have to be courageous enough to continue fighting for what's right.
Yeah, Kavish, you're right. So it might be saddening to think about how we as individuals only have so many years left to live. But when you think about the climate crisis, you have to think about the whole of humankind, the whole planet has 10 years left uh, before it's too late. And because of that, I think that courage is extremely important. And we have to make a change as fast as possible so that we can have a chance um, to live with this thing in the future.
Yeah.
Now, before we conclude this episode, are there any resources available for our listeners to maybe learn more on the causes and effects of climate change? Maybe you have some sources that maybe you would like to tell our listeners for them to be better informed with regards to climate change.
So Greenpeace is a great website. They have a great, they have a lot of political stuff on their website, but they also have a lot of great stuff that they talk about. If you want to learn about the more political aspect of climate change, go on sunrisemovement.org. Um, you know, and also feel free to crack open a what's it called, an earth science textbook, or what's it called? I know earth science isn't people's favorite science class, but you know Feel free to crack one open. Feel free to look at those
Mhm.
resources that you may have at school.
Yeah. Don't go onto the Exxon Mobil website. Would not recommend. They'll just lie to you. But do go to the places Kavise listed.
Okay, so I think that this is a perfect place to close out our discussion and to close out the first episode in the two-part special on the climate crisis.
Yeah, you guys both offered some really fantastic perspectives and valuable insights. I hope both our listeners and me and Ali can benefit from this discussion because you guys presented some great facts and some things that we really have to think about.
Yeah, thank you all for having us.
Thank you guys so much
Yeah.
for the opportunity.
And with that, we conclude the 7th episode of Open Floor.
We still want to continue the discussion with you guys, though. If you have any thoughts on this episode and the topics that we discussed, please DM us on Instagram at Open Floor Podcast or get in touch with us via our website, openfloor.me/home.
I also want to thank Amin Purgol Mohammad for producing this and all of our episodes.
Make sure to tune into the second part of this two-part special where we discuss what we can do as a community to combat the climate crisis.
I'm Ali Mosallei,
And I'm Aryan Narayan.
and until next time, thank you for listening to Open Floor.